You can see my messy desk. But I remember email back and forth where they were saying in September.
How and when did you meet Foster Wallace? He sent you the manuscript and room back in 1985. Can you tell us what struck you that manuscript back then?
Well, I had just started as a literary agent. I mean, literally about 3 weeks before this manuscript came. And I'd moved from New York. I'd worked in publishing in New York. And David had just moved probably a month before to Tucson, Arizona, because he was getting his MFA at the University of Arizona. And he sent out query letters with explaining who he was, that he had won these prizes in college, and that he was now getting his MFA. And our agency was on the list of, I guess, a couple of agencies which he knew about to send things to. And he sent it to us because we were in San Francisco, and he was in Arizona, which in terms of the United States is very close. I mean, much closer than, let's say, Arizona is to New York. So because I had just started and I had no clients and no books to my name, I would open the mail and I would answer the phone. And anyone who called and asked about, how to send a query letter or how to submit a book, I would be the one they would talk to. And I had worked in publishing enough to know about all of that, but I'd never been an agent. And I opened this up, and it was a letter. And in the letter, he used the word diachronic, which I didn't know what it meant. I mean, it of course means out of order, but I didn't know that then. And he sort of said, I'm 23 or 24 years old, and and at that point I was a year older, and so we were just starting, and he sent a chapter that was out of order of Brim of the System, which is why he used the word diachronic, and I started reading it and I loved it, and since I didn't have anything else to do, I said, well, can you send the rest of the manuscript quickly? And I started reading it, and I could read it much faster than any other agent because that's what I did. And I fell in love with the energy of it. I fell in love with the story, which was about girls just out of college. So it spoke to me because it felt very close to my own life. We had gone to very similar schools. I had gone to Williams. He had gone to Amherst, which are both in Massachusetts, and which are schools that play each other in football and play each other in lots of games. So we never knew each other in school, but we knew the same kind of people, and we had had a very similar kind of university experience. So I think when I started writing to him, he felt very comfortable with me because I was a year older than he was. We had gone to the same kind of school, and I loved what he was trying to do. And at that point, American fiction was very minimalist. I mean, Raymond Carver was a huge star. It was the years of Bright Lights, Big City, and Less Than Zero, and Slaves of New York. And so it was this real sort of brat pack American fiction. I mean, it was the same thing in movies, but that was what was being published. And here was this novel that was big and bulky and imaginative and maximalist and over the top, and had the Great Ohio Desert in it, which of course doesn't exist. And it was nothing like what was out there. And so within a month, I had read the whole manuscript. I had made some suggestions to him of how to change it and where to cut things. I do remember having a big conversation with him because the book ends in mid-sentence. It ends where it's like, I'm a man of my, and then it ends. And I thought I was a very smart 25-year-old at that point. I was like, you can't end mid-sentence. You can't end without telling us the end of the story. You're not Thomas Pynchon. Who do you think you are? And David wrote me back a very long explanation of Wittgensteinian principles of why it was the way it was. And to this day, I don't actually understand enough about Wittgenstein to tell you what this meant, but I knew he was way smarter than I was, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and so I left it. And then I sent the book out to a number of editors in New York, out of which only one bid on the book. And it was an editor who I knew well because we had worked together on Brett Ellis's Less Than Zero, because I had worked for the publishing house that had published the hardcover, and he had bought the paperback rights. And I had sort of convinced him at the time why he should buy the paperback rights, because I loved it. And so Jerry Howard, who at that point worked for Viking Penguin, bought the book for $20,000 or $25,000, which in those days was more money than it is now, but still not a lot of money. And everyone else turned it down. And it was published about a year later in a small hardcover printing and a very large paperback printing. Not large, I mean 25,000 copies. And it got a lot of attention. And I do remember saying to the man who I worked for at the time and then became partners with, like, you know, this fiction, this agent stuff, this is pretty easy. Because it was like, you know, reviews, front page of the Washington Post and front page of the LA Times and a daily New York Times and a Sunday New York Times. And I was like, this is pretty easy selling books. And he was like, it's not usually this way. And that's how we started.
Great. How your relationship developed from then on, after this first encounter?
We became friends, and I got to know his best friend from college. He met my parents. He met my roommates, because we all shared a Victorian in San Francisco together. He used to come stay with us and sleep on, you know, the sofa or sleep on the floor, because those were the years where one did that, and he didn't have very much money. And, you know, would come stay in my parents' apartment in New York if he needed to stay someplace. And so we really became friends, and we grew up in publishing together.
You were more than an agent in a way, from what I've read. I mean, he wrote to you during the years why he was having problems, why he was drinking a lot, he was smoking pot, feeling bad. I mean, can you tell us what were the most intense moments of your friendship, or challenging moments of your friendship, to be entitled to so many responsibilities?
Well, after Brim and the System was published, and I don't think I'm going to remember the dates exactly. David went through a bad stage, which was after Girl with Curious Hair was published, which would have been 88 or 89. I think it was 89. And it was a collection of stories. It's a collection of stories that I love. I think it's absolutely, to this day, a brilliant collection of stories. But it didn't get a lot of attention, and it didn't sort of get, I think, what he would have wanted. And things went downhill for him for a long time, for a while after that. He was getting acclaim when you're young, and that young, like when you're 25, 26, can be really difficult for some people. And I think for David, it was particularly difficult. Some people can take success young in hand, and I think he was both incredibly ambitious and very ambivalent about being successful, and being successful so early. And I knew he was in hospitals. He would write to me from the hospital. I went to visit him in McLean's, which is the psychiatric hospital that's part of Mass General and associated with Harvard. And, you know, going to a lock ward where there's no locks on the bathrooms, and they take away your keys, and they take away anything sharp that you have. And I went with his best friend from Amherst, Mark Costello. That was really intense. I had never been in the locked ward before. I never knew what that was like. And I remember seeing David, and he looked dreadful. And I somehow convinced one of the nurses or one of the aides to give me a scissor so I could cut his hair. And I cut his hair because I was like, you can't, like, be like this here. And so, I mean, I knew the bad years, and there were bad years, and there were scary years. where I really feared for him. And he would write me these letters that were kind of heartbreaking.
If you should choose some adjective to describe him, I mean, which one would you choose? I mean, how would you describe him? What were the most important things which describes him?
I mean, I would actually say kind. I mean, David was really kind. He was kind to the assistants who worked for the editors he dealt with. He was kind to the editorial assistants at the magazines. He never forgot someone's name. He never got high and mighty. I mean, to the end, when he was doing a story on Roger Federer at Wimbledon for the New York Times sports magazine that no longer exists, we were dealing with an editor who, you know, I mean, David at that point was in his 40s. The editor might have been 28, 29, and he was calling him Mr. And I'm like, David, you can't call him Mr. He's like 15 years younger than we are. You know, he should be calling you Mr. And he was excessively polite, as only Midwesterners can be polite. New Yorkers and Californians are not polite like this. And he was the child of academics, and I think he had the best manners of anyone, of, you know, holding doors, standing up when someone older walked in. He never put on, you know, David never put on airs. There's certainly a lot of writers who, as they get more successful, become like an 800-pound gorilla. This was never him. He was always the opposite. But he didn't miss anything. I mean, there was nothing going on, and you can see that in his nonfiction, that there's nothing going on that he misses, but you never notice it. I mean, I think when he was on the McCain campaign, they never knew who he was. They, like, never understood who he was. He was, like, some guy from Rolling Stone. He was always under the radar. He never talked to McCain. The man, you know, the PR, not the PR rep, but, you know, the communications director would just sort of ignore him and run from him. And he never had the wherewithal to be like, excuse me, you have to talk to me. He would just watch. But what he saw when he watched is more than most of us ever see, no matter how much we talk to people.
We have talked about the most intense moments in the hospital, and some supposedly fun things that you've done together. There must have been also, I imagine, good moments, funny moments.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was lots of things. I mean, I remember being in New York and having dinner with a bunch of my friends from college and his friends from college. I mean, this was pretty early on. And we were playing a game of sort of the weirdest two words one could put together. And a friend of mine said the words moist loincloth. Moist like damp, and loincloth like where you, like,
yeah,
you know,
okay.
right. I have no idea how to translate that into Italian. Yeah. And he was like, that's so great. I'm going to put that in a book. And I think he put it in Infinite Jest somewhere. I can't tell you where anymore, but I mean, he would come up with funny ideas and funny games. I remember years later, he and Karen came to LA for something, and my son, who was probably about 7 or 8 at the time and was really into dinosaurs, and I had a client who had given him some dinosaur claws and bones, and David got so excited because he had been into fossils when he was a boy, and so he sat down with my son and was just like, oh, let's look at this one, let's look at that one, and was telling him stories about the fossils and what he knew about dinosaurs, and it was really sweet. I mean, I can't think of, like, you know, I mean, there was lots of times of sort of hanging out together, I mean, a lot of years where he was in Illinois and I would only see him sometimes, but certainly he would come to San Francisco, he would come to New York, he would come to Chicago, and I'd see him in Chicago.
If you should draw a graph of his life, where would you put his highs and his lows? For instance, talking about his personal private life in 2002 when he met Karen. It seems to be very happy, wasn't it?
He was really happy. I mean, he loved her. He was really happy. He had just moved to California and had taken a job at Pomona College. So he was settled and a full professor there and teaching students he really liked and liked California. And then they got married in 2004. In 2006, they went to Capri for this big writers' festival there. And there are beautiful pictures of him in Capri, of him tan and smiling and happy. And, I mean, that's part of the reason why his suicide was such a shock, because there were really good years. Like 2002 on, those were really nice years. I mean, we were all a bit older, a bit more mature. He was writing whatever he felt, what he wanted to write. And it wasn't like the early years where he was, you know, can we get another check? Can we get more money? I am starving. I have no money. These were like already sort of more mature years. And I really thought, you know, there was going to be another novel and there was going to be more books. And those were the easy years. The late 80s, early 90s were bad years.
Are you talking about his mood or also professional?
It was sort of a combination. I mean, I would say he was hospitalized in, I'm not going to remember the dates of those years, but it was sort of like somewhere between 89 and 91. And then he was starting Infinite Jest. There was no money. He started doing magazine stories, and that's when he realized he could write journalism the way he wanted to write journalism, as well as doing fiction. And then, so I would say there was a couple of bad years where he was doing jobs he hated. He was working, you know, at one point he was working at a health club as a towel boy after having won a Whiting Award, and which is a big writing award that one wins usually as a young writer here. And somebody else who had won a Whiting the same year he did walked into the health club, and here was David as the towel boy, and here was this man as a member. And, you know, he just hid because he was so embarrassed. You know, he was living in rundown, sort of awful apartments with people he didn't know very well and didn't like, but he was also gathering material that became part of Infinite Jest.
You spoke with him a couple of weeks before he committed suicide. Do you remember anything of that call? Which was the impression you had? You felt worried, or I mean, being a good period after all, you didn't imagine anything at all?
No, I mean, it was 2007, end of 2007, he had gone off the antidepressant medication he'd been on for years, and it had not gone well. And then 2008, I'm trying to remember, he was still teaching his classes in spring of 2008, but then took a leave of absence. And in May and June, he still was okay enough that we were discussing him doing a piece on Obama, who was then running, who still did not have the nomination at that point. And it was going to be a piece about Obama and rhetoric, because Obama was giving these amazing speeches. And we were figuring out, could he get access to the speechwriters, and where would he go? And GQ, which was the magazine who wanted him to do it, had booked him a room at the Democratic Convention because they already had to put their dibs in on getting a room. But then in June, things got very bad. And I think at that point, I had to tell the magazine that it was not going to happen. And I also had to start keeping people away, because there were always, whether it was foreign publishers or magazines or people who were like, can we get a quote from him? Can he answer a few questions? Can we, use this? And actually, in the summer, it was Martina Testa at Minimum Facts that they were doing maybe it was a 20th anniversary booklet of what Minimum Facts had published, and they wanted him to add something to one of his books, or she wanted to ask him a few questions. And I had to tell her that he was sick. And of course I started with, oh, he has a cold, oh, he has the flu. And then it became, oh, he has some sort of immune deficiency. I would come up with these very vague excuses of why he couldn't talk to anyone. Because at that point he had said, like, I can't talk to anyone, I can't do anything. So in the summer I knew things were very bad. But when I talked to him a few weeks before he committed suicide, it seemed like he was coming out of it. It seemed better. And I had said to them, like, could you please talk to the Italians? Could you please help them? And he was like, no, not yet, maybe in a few weeks. And they, of course, were going to press, so they couldn't wait any longer. But I remember sort of saying, could you possibly do something, even on email, and he was like, no, I can't. I wish I could, but I can't. But I wasn't that worried. I had been worried over the summer, but at that point, it seemed a little better. And I totally misread the signs. I mean, everybody around him did. I'd since talked to people who lived in Claremont, the town he lived in, who knew him really well, and the husband and wife were both like, we thought he was getting better too. A man who had had breakfast with him the day after Labor Day, so in early September, like a week before he died. And he said, no, he was talking about things he was going to do and how it was going to get better. And, we all thought the same thing.
What do you miss more of him? Which kind of talks do you have about politics, literature, music, movies? What do you talk about, and what do you miss more?
All of those things. I mean, we used to talk about politics because, it was the Bush years, which, needless to say, neither of us were big fans of. And so we would both talk about that. We certainly talked about the 2008 elections and what we thought, and what was going on at the time with Obama. And, we talk about everything. I mean, not so much about literature, because I think when you're someone's agent, you don't actually talk literature with someone. You talk mechanics, you talk details, you talk information, but it's not so much, oh, I read this great book and what do you think of it? But I would talk about my kids. He would ask about them. He knew them both. He would talk about his sister and his nieces. We would just talk about regular life. He would talk about Karen and what she was doing and her art. I missed the conversations. I really missed just talking to him. I mean, I went for the longest time where I could not hear his voice. I could read him. After a while, there was no problem. I could not listen to him talking because it was just too close. And in the old days, one does not have YouTube and, audio of people who are dead, but now, of course, you do. And they seem alive still.
He didn't have TV, and he had a very slow internet connection, it seems, but still seemed to be very much into the world. I mean, very much connected with what was going on around him. How did he manage to do these paradoxical things? I mean, be out of the world and into the world?
The thing about TV is he would have TV for a while, and then he would throw the TV away. Because he would feel like he would get addicted to watching TV. And that whenever the writing was not going well, he, of course, would watch TV. And he would watch anything. I mean, it wouldn't have to be something you actually wanted to watch. It could be like watching, infomercials. It could be watching test patterns. It wouldn't matter what he watched. So then he would throw it out and put it on the street and have it, be picked up by the garbage or someone would pick it up. Internet, to the end, he had dial-up connection, which meant, by the time something downloaded, you'd be a year older. And he never, I mean, he switched to email at some point, but it was really under duress. And he would have these crazy email addresses that with secrets, that were not known, and that I, of course, would email him, and he would email me back. But then when I would forward it on to people, I would have to get rid of his email address so they wouldn't answer him to his email address, because he would check it like once a week, as opposed to everybody else who, of course, checks it about every 3 seconds. And, never had a cell phone, but he never turned it on. Never had a BlackBerry, never had, there were no iPhones in those days, but never had any of the things that the rest of us sort of walk around with every day. But yes, he managed to sort of know all of this, and in some cases foretell a lot of what is going on. So that in Infinite Jest, where he has, the year of the Depend undergarment, the year of this, the year of that, all of that, we pretty much live in that world now. And he wrote this in the early 90s when we didn't live in that world yet. We were starting to, but not quite. And in the end, they had a TV. When he and Karen were in Claremont, they actually had a TV. Where most of the time they would watch DVDs, but they actually did have a TV set. I've seen that TV set.
Which brings to another question, which is about his obsession with media, which is influencing so much our life. Where did it come from, according to you?
Well, I think we grew up in an age where we came of age in the age of irony, where David Letterman and Saturday Night Live and the kind of writing and the kind of, it wasn't even sarcasm, it was irony, was sort of the reaction to everything in the world. And so when we were both in our 20s, and certainly into our 30s, that was the mechanism with which young people dealt with America and American culture. And David has had a deeply moral streak. I mean, he thought about morals and ethics in ways that I would say most of our generation did not, or did not for long periods of time. And so I think he would write about media because he would study it to see why it was the way it was. And that why did we all react the way we did against American culture or against sort of the American media? And so there's a lot of his nonfiction, like E Unum Pluribus, or the ones about American fiction, where he's thinking about that and why it is the way it is.
What struck me the most when I first encountered these books was that you could see on the page how his brain worked, in a way, the backstage of his brain. How could he be so smart and still to... Another thing which really surprised me was his empathy about almost any human being, human entity, lobsters included. I mean,
Right.
How could it be? Because in his books, you met often, at least in non-fiction books, you met often with weird figures like the pork industry and the people at the fair or at the lobster fair in Maine, and again these funny people who go on a cruise ship. I mean, you meet with many corny and strange people. He was incredibly smart and still didn't judge them. He proved empathy also for all these people. How can you manage to be so incredibly smarter than average and then to be able to prove empathy for these people so far away from him?
I think it goes back to this whole idea of being really kind. I mean, he would actually think about, do lobsters feel pain? And, I mean, when he took the assignment of go to the Lobster Festival in Maine, what the magazine wanted was for him to write a funny piece like what he wrote about the Illinois State Fair, where it's like, look at these quirky people, aren't they funny? And he, of course, didn't write that. He wrote, like, if you boil a lobster alive, is this bad? And I mean, so much so that PETA, the organization that's for, that's like don't wear fur and help animals, they afterwards were like, can we put this on our website? Because this is such a great defense of what we're trying to do. And, Gourmet, which published it, they have pages and pages of ads, or did, obviously, from the Beef Council, the Seafood Council. The whole idea is to eat these things. It's not to, sort of say, like, should we slaughter cows? Should we eat fish? Should we should we boil 1,000 lobsters in an hour, and enjoy them? David thought about the big issues. I mean, The Pale King has the most eloquent defense of why we should pay taxes that I've ever seen. And I mean, most people do not think about why it is a public good to pay taxes and why it is actually a moral imperative to pay taxes. Since most people, all they do was want to avoid paying taxes. So he thought about these things. And I mean, he thought about them in ways that other people didn't. And he never judged people. I mean, he could gently make fun of them, but it was always gently. And so, like in Supposedly Fun Thing, where he goes through this whole paroxysm of guilt about carrying his own bag, and the man who's the steward or whose job it is to carry his bag, and who gets in trouble because he's not carrying his bag, and David's like, winds up having to go to the captain to say, yes, I dragged my bag away from the man who's supposed to do this, and please don't get him in trouble, and all this stuff. I mean, we laugh about it, but he really did do these things because he was a very polite Midwesterner who thought he should never ask someone else to do something he could do for himself. And so he really, I think he could laugh about it himself, but also describe it in ways that would make us laugh. And yet think about it. I mean, it makes you think about issues you wouldn't normally think about.
So, as reporters, we are not very much entitled to doubts. While he was thinking again about Consider the Lobster, the McCain article, in which he was constantly asking himself if he was supposed to believe McCain or not believe what McCain said. And also these doubts were very engaging, were very interesting to follow. What was his relationship with with non-fiction, first of all, and then in particular with journalists, because it seems he was wary of interviews and stuff like that. So first of all, what was his relationship with non-fiction?
I know for David that non-fiction was easier for him to write than fiction. He always felt that fiction was difficult, but it was supposed to be difficult, whereas non-fiction was much easier for him. But he also never wanted to do the same kind of thing twice, because after he wrote the Illinois State Fair piece, and then wrote the one about the cruise, Supposedly Fun Thing, people were all like, oh, do that again, can you go do the Academy Awards like this, can you go do Down the Amazon like this? I mean, people would come, every magazine editor was like, I want you to do your take on that. And he didn't want to repeat himself. He didn't want to do the same thing. I mean, it's sort of like Woody Allen doing the same shtick over and over again and being the same character. And he had created a persona with these articles, but he didn't want to stay that persona. He didn't want to keep doing that over and over again. It would have been very easy. And of course, the more I said no, the more money the magazines would offer, because at that stage magazines had money. And so it'd be very hard to be like, no, we're turning you down. And I'd be like, why are we turning you down? Because I knew it would be easy, but David never did easy. The one thing he didn't usually refuse doing were articles about tennis. And because he loved tennis. He had played tennis as a teenager. He was very good at it. And so it was fun to be able to, he got to go to the U.S. Open. He went and interviewed one of a tennis player who was on the circuit, the U.S. tennis circuit, which was this piece about Michael Joyce that wound up in Esquire. And he got to go to Wimbledon and watch Roger Federer. I think he may have interviewed Roger Federer for about 30 seconds, but he wasn't a journalist. He didn't actually understand. He'd never been trained as a journalist. He never thought of himself as a journalist. So he never had this sort of idea of like being one of the guys, the boys on the bus of like the political campaigns, or being part of a group of reporters the way any journalist who is part of a group of other journalists feels that way. I mean, I represent a lot of journalists, and there's a certain camaraderie, there's a certain knowledge that comes with being a journalist and working, whether for a magazine or a daily newspaper, but you get certain things. David didn't get them. He never even understood that he was allowed certain privileges as a journalist. So he would like go sit in the stands where other people were. He would never sort of know that he could get the PR rep or the person to sort of do things for him. And because of that, he would wind up talking to, whether it's like the cameramen or the people behind the scenes in the McCain campaign who had been on every campaign like for the last 20 years, or the guys who worked at the radio station when he was doing host about talk radio. He wouldn't feel like he should be talking to the executive in charge. He'd be talking to the sound guy in the back room. And I remember when he was actually doing the article about the talk radio host, he called me up and he was like, do you know where, because the station was in Koreatown, which is in sort of that part of, like, east of here in LA. And he's like, do you know where the Kookaroo is near here? Which is like where you get chicken and like it's decent takeout food. And I was like, sure. So I gave him directions how to go. And I'm like, David, you don't have to go get the food for the crew. Like, they're supposed to bring you food as a journalist. You're not supposed to get them food. And he's like, no. I said I'd get food. So that's the sort of thing he would do, because he wouldn't think of himself as the person who's supposed to get the free food or the spread or be catered to. He did the opposite.
And the relationship with journalists, I mean, you partially already replied, actually.
Right.
When he was the subject
Right.
of the interest of journalists, how was his attitude towards requests of interviews? I imagine they were
Uncomfortable.
hundreds and hundreds.
There weren't hundreds. There were certainly more. There were more for infinite jest than for anything else. Partly because Little Brown, it was the first book that they had published. It was 1,100 pages, where people did not write 1,100-page novels. And they were scared, and they needed to get as much media and press attention as possible to get people to pick up a book that was like the size of a doorstop. And so we pressured him into doing as many interviews as possible. And he did. But he was always uncomfortable about it. He was not sure about the line between being a reporter and being a friend. And, people would come and spend time with him. And these were all smart, interesting journalists. But he was always very wary. But even as he was wary, he would say to them, I'm wary of you, like, why are you asking me this question? Are you asking me this question because you need to know this? Are you asking me this because you think I'm going to say this? He was smart enough to sort of try and get behind it and try and ask them the questions, but not someone who really played the game. He didn't really get playing the game. Actors, directors, they know how to play the game. They've had media training, or they just know. They've just been doing it enough. He never really got how you play the game. And because of that, journalists loved him because he didn't dissemble. He was himself. I mean, I'm sure you as a journalist, when you interview an actor, there's a certain kind of response that you expect to get.
It seems kind of, as someone has noted, a canonization is taking place. There are bunches of scholarly books about Foster Wallace, now an archive at the University of Texas, and then you were involved in a website which would be a companion, I think, of the Bailey King. A lot of things are moving very quickly. I mean, someone has said that after Don DeLillo will be the next canonized American author. What do you think about this, and what, if you can say that, what you would think about this process of canonization?
I think he'd be very uncomfortable with it, but it wouldn't have happened if he were still alive. If he were still alive, none of this would exist, I think. I mean, David was a very well-respected writer. He was certainly a writer who got to do what he wanted to do. But this level of attention, unfortunately, I think comes from him having committed suicide. And no one knowing the level of depression he had. He kept it very quiet. He kept it very secret, other than from very close friends and family. In some ways, it's lovely to know that his work is being read and the books are having more success than they ever did while he's alive. But, you know, it's also very sad to me that this all happened after his death. His books became bestsellers after his death in ways that they never were when he was alive.
Yeah, but he sold very much even before.
He sold fine. I mean, they sell 3-4 times the amount now that they ever did when he was alive. Trust me, as someone who reads the royalty statements, I actually can tell you this. You know, it's really 3 to 4 times as much. And when he first died, there were 3 books on the bestseller list. They had never been on the bestseller list. The New York Times, I mean, his books had never been on the New York Times bestseller list before. And it took his death for that to happen. Which is, I mean, both gratifying and terribly sad. I think we live in a speeded up culture. We live in a culture where everything moves fast. So it's 2.5 years after he died. And yes, there's an archive, and there are all these young scholars and not so young scholars who are looking at his work and reading it and finding all sorts of things. And I think, you know, for a lot of them, you get to discover things. You get to write papers and cover new ground. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so exciting for academics, that there are conferences now being set up all over the world that I hear about sometimes after the fact, sometimes before, but it's being generated by scholars and academics who all want to discover things and who appreciate his work and are getting to do firsthand. They get to be the first ones. You know, it's not like, you know, let's say doing Shakespeare or Wordsworth or, you know, Tolstoy. There have been years of people studying them. You get to be the first ones. And I think the archives are very interesting to people because there are drafts upon drafts of his work, and you get to see his thinking, and you actually get to see how meticulous a writer he was. I mean, I know for years people felt like he was sort of like, look, ma, no hand, look what I can do. You know, I can do leaps, I can do jumps, I can do sad, I can do funny. And it felt like he was just sort of putting it out there without, I don't want to say not paying attention, but sort of doing as much beforehand. But I mean, he was a meticulous editor. When you see drafts of his work, you see the type version, and then you see the next edit in one color of pen, then the next color of pen, then the next color of pen. And you realize he revised work over and over and over again before anyone saw it. I mean, even for Pale King, there were drafts upon drafts.
What's your explanation about the fact that, because this sounds new to me, that he wasn't on the bestseller, on the New York Times bestsellers list before he died? Because I discovered it before he died, and for me, for instance, it was an incredible author, much earlier than his death, of course. So, how would you explain that he never made it on the New York Times bestseller list? Was it too complicated, according to you, or what?
I think people probably thought his work was too hard or too complicated, and he was thought of maybe as not an easy writer to read. But after his death, people either felt like they should read him, or they started reading articles that made them interested, or they read other people talking about him, and so it's true. I mean, the books had been national bestsellers, but they had not really been selling at the same rate that they have after his death.
David Foster Wallace and the others. I mean, with friends, women, students, because we go back to the empathy factor. How did he have friends? Which kind of relation were there? I was very much surprised by the fact that he removed this tattoo to add an asterisk to change the name of his beloved one, and it seems he has a very intense relationship with his students, for instance. How would you describe this relationship he had with others?
I mean, David had a lot of friends. He had a lot of friends who were writers. John Franzen and Zadie Smith and George Saunders, and there were certainly any number of writers who he knew he would be generous to, he would help, he would be in correspondence with. I mean, David actually answered anyone who ever wrote him a letter or a note. He would send them back a postcard. I remember before, I think it must have been Christmas 2007, a man called up one day and he said, my son is a huge fan of David Wallace and he's turning 18 and I want to get him a hardcover copy of Infinite Jest. And if I sent you a book, would David sign it? And once we sort of realized this man was not, a stalker or weird or whatever, and it really was a father who loved his son and wanted to give him a really great Christmas present, I said, sure, send us, I was like, send us a book, because he already bought the book. And I think he'd gone out and found a first edition, which at that point was hard to find, and he sent us the hardcover, and I sent it to David, and I was like, could you, send it back to him? And he went to the post office, which at Christmas, certainly in America, and I'm sure in Italy, is no fun to do, to stand in line at the post office so that he could then send it back to this man for his son. And he did, and he wrote a note to him, and so he would do things like that. This is completely off the subject of what you were talking about. But, I mean, he had a lot of friends and would do all sorts of favors for people. He was very close to his students. I knew much less about that side of his life in all the years we worked together because the teaching side was not the part that we would really talk about. But certainly after he died and there was a memorial at Pomona College, his students spoke and I got to know some of them and they loved him. I mean, he was probably the most exciting teacher they could have, and he made them work really hard, and his assignments were difficult, and his papers that he assigned, that he asked them to write were difficult, but they respected him and they loved him. And I think for the ones who knew him well, it was really, really hard for them.
A couple of last questions, then we'll pass to the baking. I read on The Believer that about his visceral antipathy for the bush ears, as you said before, and he was making a list of things that he wanted to improve, and he also said, also, I want to floss more. He said, in a way, maybe it's just a detail, but for someone who's gonna to commit suicide, I mean, to be...
You wouldn't worry about your teeth.
Yeah. What was his relationship with his health, apart from depression? Did he exercise? Did he meditate? Did he...
You know, he had dogs, and so he would always like go running with his dogs, take the dogs to the park. I mean, he had been an athlete, so you know, he had been a really good tennis player, and I think he always kept a certain part of the athlete's way of doing things. I mean, of a certain level of competition and of being good at sports. And I mean, tennis was his sport. I mean, he certainly never played football or anything like that. And I certainly have never had a conversation with him about baseball, for example. But he, you know, he kept an athlete's way of thinking about things. I mean, he would get sick. He would, you know, for years he smoked cigarettes. Then he chewed tobacco. So he would always get these weird flus and like ailments from being sick, you know, from smoking too much and all of that. But I mean, he seemed to have a pretty normal relationship with his health.
In 2004, I've read that it was a hard time proceeding with the Pale King, and he and Karen, they talked about, at least he said to Karen that he was considering about quitting writing and opening a dog shelter. Is it true to life to you? I mean,
you know, he would always say that he's gonna, you know, he was gonna like save all the dogs in the dog shelter. He was gonna sort of take on all the, you know, poor unwanted dogs. But that's sort of, you know, there are people who say like, I'm gonna quit my job and go like make cheese. That's sort of like his version of like, I'm gonna quit my job and go make cheese, or like go open a bakery or things like that. I don't think he was ever gonna do it.
okay.
But he really did love dogs a lot.
No doubt about it. But does it sound possible to you, David Foster Wallace, without writing?
No. I mean, writing was such a huge part of his life. It was so much a part of who he was, of how he defined himself. Even when it was going badly, that's how he defined himself. And I mean, I think every writer, there's a point where you throw up your hands and you go like, I can't write this. I'm never going to do this again. But that's sort of part of being a writer.
Okay, The Pale King.
Okay.
He started working on it around 1997 and started writing it in 2000, if I'm correct. Why did he choose such a weird and sexy topic? I mean, taxes. I mean,
Taxes.
I've read Michael Pierce, who's written that is basically the opposite of fiction, because in fiction you leave out what is not interesting and you focus on what is interesting. And
Right.
here, the topic itself is very, again, unsexy, is taxes.
Right.
How came did he choose such a weird topic, according to you?
I have no idea why he picked taxes and IRS agents as his subject matter. I do remember at some point when he told me, I'm writing a novel about an IRS facility in the Midwest in the 1980s. I think I went, ha! Because it did seem not bizarre, but certainly not anything that anybody else would ever think of. I can't think of any other book where tax agents and accountants are the stars of a book. And actually someone asked us, a journalist asked recently, like, have any of us contacted the Internal Revenue Service to ask what they think of the book? And it's like, no, like, I wouldn't even know how to start to contact the IRS to say, do you want to read this? He started taking accounting classes in about 1997 or 98 when he was still living in Illinois. And because he was so good at math, he took more and more advanced accounting classes. And when we were going through his papers in his office, we found all these accounting books, which we packed up and sent to Michael Peach, which Michael has more tax and accounting books than he probably knows what to do with or even wants. And David would find these accountants to correspond with, to ask them questions about the most arcane details about taxes, about S corporations, or about, how you filter income, or all sorts of things. And they loved it. I mean, you can imagine most people who are accountants don't get asked a lot of questions about what they do. And so there are these letters where the accountants say, like, I'm up in the middle of night, feel free to call me anytime, even 3 a.m, any questions you might have. I mean, even his own accountant, he isn't Karen's accountants who would do their taxes. This man loved him because he and David would sit there and David would ask him, so when you fill out this form, what does it mean? Nobody asked those questions. And he understood the math enough to get parts of it that most of us, either don't pay attention to, don't have any interest in. Most of us just feel like it's like something you do, like going to the dentist, but it's not something you actually enjoy. So I don't know where the idea came from. The book does have all sorts of events in it that most of us would rather never endure. Like, there's a bus ride in it, which is like the worst bus trip ever. There's a traffic jam, which you're laughing hysterically, but it's an awful, awful traffic jam. There's lines that people stand in that go on forever. There's, of course, the people who are the IRS agents, they're called wigglers, because that's what you're called when you first start, and they do the most tedious jobs. But he makes it fascinating. There's characters stuck in an elevator for about 3 hours, and they're having a conversation, and it goes on forever.
How much of David Foster Wallace there is in David Wallace in the book?
Well,
because it has been said there is mock memoir in a way because of this. Yeah.
It is and it isn't. There are various things from various characters in the novel which come from him. And knowing him well, I know which ones they are, but I sort of leave it to the reader to figure it out. But yes, the character of David Wallace, there are actually 2 David Wallaces in the novel. One whom you meet, one whom you don't really meet. And the one who you do get to know, who is supposedly him, it's very funny. You cringe for him, but it's very funny.
And then there's another one you don't meet.
Right, there's one, because there's the David Wallace who comes to work in the IRS facility as a wiggler. And then there's another David Wallace who's a bigwig in the Internal Revenue Service who's coming to help run things, but who you barely meet because he's not an important character, but he's also named David Wallace.
Okay, 2 of them. I've read somewhere this is a note that should be in the book. Play or a note about the book written by Foster Wallace. Pay close attention to the most tedious thing you can think of, and then boredom comes in waves. Write this out, and it's like going from black and white into color. I mean, it make a theory out of this very tedious kind of details, and use them in a way as an antidote towards boredom and stuff like this. I mean, it seems that to experience bliss, you have to deeply into pain.
It's actually, that note is in, there are notes and afterwards in the book. And I mean, can I get up?
Yes.
Okay. I can find the exact quote for you because it's much, it's, he says it much better than I will ever say it. What he's talking about is people who, he calls them immersives, and he said they're rare, but they're among us. People able to achieve and sustain a certain steady state of concentration, attention, despite what they're doing. And he says, and he gives an example of an Asian kid in one of the reading rooms in a business college who is reading and reads in the exact same position forever. I mean, just for a very long time. And he says a guard working security outside a credit union, standing at parade rest all day, can't read or chat, simply watching people come in and out, nodding when nodded at. And the fact that he sees this. This is someone who we all see every day. And he says he's able to pay attention even in what has to be a staggeringly dull job. He's looking for the ability to be immersed. Here it is. He's talking about a character named Drinyan, and it says Drinyan is happy, ability to pay attention. It turns out that bliss, a second-by-second joy and gratitude at the gift of being alive, conscious, lies at the other side of crushing boredom. Pay close attention to the most tedious thing you can find. Tax returns, televised golf, and in waves, a boredom like you've never known will wash over you and just about kill you. Ride these out, and it's like stepping back from black and white into color, like water after days in the desert, constant bliss in every atom. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. But going back to the question I posed you before, why I choose this topic,
Right.
according to you, is just because of this, that he wants to show that, in a way, boredom could be, if you know how to manage,
Right.
if you learn how to manage, as this guy, these rare people manage to do, you can really savor every little tiny slice of your day, everything that happens to you. Once you have overcome boredom, you can enjoy more all the rest, according to you?
Well, I mean, I think it's partly what This Is Water is about too. It's like where he's trying to tell to, people who are graduating from college and sort of going into the world for the first time, which is learning what to pay attention to, learning how to live in this world, and that our day-to-day lives have moments of soul-crushing boredom and tedium, and for some of us more than others, and some of us are lucky to not have very much of it. But, every day that you're on in a traffic jam you hate, or in the midst of something you don't like, I mean, we all experience this. And I think David was trying to write about the big questions. It's like, what do we love? What do we deal with in the world? What do we pay attention to? And I mean, we live in a culture where people don't know all the time what to pay attention to. We pay attention to trivia. We pay attention to nonsense so much of the time. And he's trying to figure out what to pay attention to. What matters? What really matters? And I think he was always trying to figure it out for himself.
Yes, this brings us to the big issue, according to me, because this is exactly a sign of high wisdom,
Right.
which is the topic of, which is the meaning of the life, if we want to put it in very broad terms. And how do you reconcile the fact that he showed and he wrote about this wisdom of the fact that at 46 years he took his life away? I mean, how would you reconcile this? This guy was able to see, to understand, to teach to the others in a way something like this. So he could understand it perfectly, and he could express it better than anyone else. And then for himself, I mean, there's this kind of schizophrenia between being able to say some wise things and then behaving in an opposite way.
You know, I'll never understand it. I'll never get it. Sorry. I'm good for a long time and then I'm not. I don't know.
Sorry, but
it's okay. Don't worry about it.
we're almost done. This was the. You have already said how he researched the courses he made, the stuff like that, and from what he left, from the manuscript he left, I've read were around 5,000 pages.
No, not that much. No, not that much.
Okay.
You know, we went through this at in the January after he had committed suicide.
Yeah.
So my recollections of this are probably not the best.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say maybe it's 2,000 pages, maybe 1,000 pages. But if you need to know more precisely, I would say you could, send an email to Michael Peach because he has all the material. I mean, we packed all this up. We put it in duffel bags, and he took it back with him to New York. And we did it because Karen needed to get out of the house that she was in, and it was just, it was just too hard to keep living there. So, my memory of, I was like, it was a lot. I'd say it's probably 2,000 pages. Maybe it's less.
Yeah.
But there's lots of versions of this. I mean, the book is 500-page book.
500 pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the book's with all the notes aside is 535 pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very naive question to pose to the agent, but still I do it.
Okay.
Are you happy with the result of this teaching and editing? Yeah. Because it's a very complicated.
It was
book
very
to
complicated.
do. That he says an unfinished novel, right?
Right, because it is unfinished. I mean, it doesn't end. I mean, I feel like it will be a very satisfying experience for a reader because it's not, it's not a pamphlet. It's not, oh, we found a couple of pages in the attic and here it is. I mean, it's a 500-odd page novel. And you get immersed in a world and with characters, but it doesn't get tied up at the end in a bow. So, but I feel like with the notes and asides, you get to see a sense of where he was going to go with certain characters and what he was thinking. Am I satisfied with it? Very. I think it's a beautiful book. I think Michael Peach has done an amazing job. I've read it through 3 times, all the way through. He's probably read it through 10 times. 99% of this is David's work. What we did is we had to create an order out of it. If you read Michael Peach's editorial note, there was not a clear order to the book, and so we had to come up with, and he did more than anyone, come up with a sense of where pieces fell. And there was a couple of times where there are long sections, and then there are very short little vignettes where we had to decide where some of these vignettes would go. But I don't think it doesn't change anything about the book. It just sort of gives you light moments in between heavier ones.
Okay, so he did the cut from the original, and then he stitched pieces together.
Well, I mean, there were notes of sort of how generally the book would go, and from where we started, where we thought the book began, was not where it actually began, and then later, as we sort of uncovered the computer disks and sort of all the pieces of it, Michael realized that where we thought the book had started was not where it started. It started in a different place, and so he had to move it around so that it started where David intended it to start, which is with one of the characters arriving in this town in the Midwest, in Peoria, essentially.
Because it seems that David left some notes about how to put things. I mean, he wanted also Karen to find this document. He tied it up, it seems, before.
Well, it was sitting on his desk. I mean, it's like if you walked in and you saw something sitting there, you'd be like, okay, we're supposed to find this. Yeah. It was, it was very much like, here it is, front and center. And then there were various drafts. I mean, David was not the tidiest of authors. So there were pages and drafts in these big sort of plastic bins, like where you store things. There were things, in piles, and it took a bit, but we sort of realized, that these were all different. They were different drafts of some of the same chapters. Some of them were very polished. Some of them were less polished. Some of them were in what he would call zero draft form, which is zero draft, like a first draft form. Okay. I mean, Michael actually, when you read the editorial note, it gives a good sense of what, sort of how it all worked and how he assembled it.
Okay.
But it was not edited very much at all.
Okay.
It was more a matter of ordering it. It was not really a matter of editing it.
What about the website that you will do to accompany this? What will we include?
The website is going to have an entire chapter from the first draft all the way through to the most polished draft, so that, and I mean, this you might ask Little Brown, because they're the ones developing the website in conjunction with the University of Texas. I've seen the prototype of it, and it will be up probably in the next 2-3 weeks. It will certainly be up before publication, so you'll be able to see it. And so it shows the whole process from first draft through editing stages, after editing stages by David, to a finished draft of one chapter. And we decided to put the notes and asides at the end of the book so that people can see it.
Okay, so it will be all the editing David has done.
Right. It will not, I mean, it's not editing that Michael did.
Okay. Okay. I've read on the Independent, the British newspaper, kind of very brief review, actually. At the very end, it says, Steel is a novel which is largely about crushing boredom. Then it ends like saying, this makes it a tough sell. What do you think about that he managed to transform boredom into something else?
It's not really, see, I don't really think it's about boredom. I mean, it's about, I think it really becomes about what we pay attention to and how we live in the world. I don't think, there's no part of it that you think, oh my God, this book is so boring. I mean, it's about how people learn to concentrate and learn how to pay attention. I mean, there are certainly sections where it goes on. But that, like, one can say that about Infinite Jest. One can say that about anything he writes, because it's, David wrote in loops. And that's how his mind worked. And he would loop around and loop around and loop around. But there's no part where you think, oh, this is so boring. I actually find the tax sections really entertaining and kind of fascinating, because I must say, I really have never thought about the American Tax Act of 1986 that changed tax policy. I wasn't paying attention. I mean, the whole point he makes is that nobody was paying attention, and that by making it as sort of difficult to pay, as boring as they did, no one paid attention. So it's like hiding in plain sight.
Okay, the very last thing I would like to end up with a cheerful note if we manage. I've been told that, and I've read that in Capri, I wasn't there unfortunately, but he was very brilliant, very happy. Again, can you tell us the last things that you remember him being very brilliant? And again, there is this kind of schizophrenia between being so dark in a way. The part of him was very dark inside, and then it could be so brilliant outside. Can you give us the last example of him being very brilliant, funny? The last memory you have of him being funny.
I mean, there are pictures, I wasn't in Capri either, but the people who were there, I mean, he's a Midwestern boy, which means you don't eat a lot of things that, Mediterranean cultures eat. So it's like he sent me a note saying, like, I ate octopus, like, which for him was a big deal, because it would never have occurred to him to eat octopus. And the pictures, actually, there are two Italian photographers who these pictures are by these two really good Italian photographers, and they're beautiful, beautiful pictures of him smiling, of him tan, of him relaxed, and it's sort of just great to see, because he wasn't someone who traveled outside the United States a lot. I mean, for years that I knew him, he never had a passport. I'd be like, how can you not have a passport? And he finally got one, I think, when he was about 30-something. He was enormously curious about the world, but he wasn't someone who felt he had to go a lot of places. So for him to go to Italy and go to Capri and be at these big dinners every night and eat octopus and have a great time and be with a lot of writers and a lot of friends and then go to Wimbledon after that, I think he was gloriously, deliriously happy. And it's nice that, like, it was Italy that made him happy. I mean, he was happy being married. He was happy with sort of, the basic things of, like, having a house he really liked and a wife he loved and students who he liked teaching and really enjoyed working with. I think there was a lot that made him happy.
Thank you.